Okay, so let me come back to the original reason for even broaching this whole topic in the first place that I spent now 4 videos talking about. I said I want to talk about how an object-oriented design is created because it's going to affect how we understand design. In a more BDUF approach, the design is essentially complete before anyone begins to write code. You end up with massive design documentation, and those documents, because of how much there is, it's just difficult to comprehend, wrap your brain around, and it potentially becomes outdated and obsoleted before the end of the project. Designs that look great on paper can be difficult to implement or have unintended consequences. You might be inclined to use inheritance or delegate too many responsibilities to a class, but when you're sitting in the code and you're writing it, you might feel uneasy about those design decisions, and the flaws and the cracks begin to reveal themselves and become more obvious. A BDUF design tends to be more brittle. It doesn't account for the inevitability of change. When change comes, it potentially destroys weeks and months worth of work. But in a more agile approach, the design is revealed in smaller, more digestible units of time and work in concert with the actual implementation of the software. And the benefit of that is that it's happening while there's still time to adjust the direction, and we don't have to throw out the proverbial baby with the bathwater. So the team worries about this week's iteration and keeps the design flexible, knowing that change is going to come. That's part of it. It builds change into the software development process, treating it as an inevitability. It embraces the inevitability of change. In a more BDUF approach, the design is done way in advance on paper, in other words, codified in some alternate language, some alternate tool, and those alternate expressions of the design have to be maintained constantly in order for that design to remain relevant to the system. Much time and effort is spent in either keeping the design documents relevant, or the more likely scenario is that the development team begins to distrust the design documents because they no longer reflect the reality of the business need. In an agile approach, the code is the design. It is the documentation of how the business works today, right now. The design is not set in stone because that's not how businesses work. They evolve quickly, and the code that expresses the business rules of the business must keep pace with it. In a more BDUF approach, there's a distinct period of analysis, a period of design, and then a period of development, and then a period of testing. But in a more agile approach, those lines are blurred. It all kind of happens at the same time in a more organic fashion. The design is discovered over time, and it's a less structured, more fluid process that blends analysis, design, implementation, and testing in a setting where all the people who will use the software and build the software are sitting in the same physical space and able to communicate and able to check and balance each other. So there's so much more that I can say about the difference between these two approaches, but I want to emphasize that what we're going to talk about in this course is important because whether your company decides to take a more formal approach or a less formal approach to the process of design and development, that's a separate matter entirely from the principles of and the philosophies of object-oriented programming, which is what we're going to be covering. However, who is doing the designing and when they're creating the design does have some impact on the ultimate design of the system. In my opinion, the more design that happens without the involvement of the developers means a more brittle design, and it becomes a huge risk in the project. Object-oriented programming is about creating flexible, interchangeable objects that decrease the complexity of implementation and decrease the resistance of the application to the effects of change. It eases the maintenance of the system, makes it more resilient to the impact and the inevitability of change long term. And if you ignore this, then it's more likely your application will be brittle and less resilient to the inevitability of change. That's why I advocate, as do many practitioners in 2016, for a more agile approach whenever designing software. So design can happen up front It can happen in a more real-time fashion, and this typically impacts the ultimate design of the system, whether you like it or not. There's nothing actionable that you, the viewer of this video, can actually do with that information just yet. Just keep in mind that as we go forward, that design is a process. It's not a one-time event in an application's lifecycle. Keep in mind that there are different approaches and different timelines in which design happens. Some people prefer to do it all up front. Some people prefer to do it in a more real-time, on a more real-time basis. But those decisions, they shouldn't impact the design. The philosophy should transcend those things, but in reality, it will make an impact on the ultimate design. And following the principles and the patterns of object-oriented programming, I think will begin to lead you to realize that it makes more sense to evolve the design rather than doing it all in one fell swoop up front. Okay, so with that said, we can get back to the business of talking about those principles and patterns and objectives and goals of object-oriented programming. We'll start that in the next video. Thanks.